Hello, and welcome to CAN TV Conversations. I'm Daisy Kershaw, and today we're talking about homelessness in the Chicago public school system during COVID-19. Joining me today is Alyssa Phillips, the education attorney at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. Thank you so much for joining me today, Alyssa.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start by asking you how the work you do has changed during the pandemic, and specifically with the switch between online and in-person learning when helping your students.
Definitely. So, like for most people, the transition was definitely intense. So we went from doing our legal services that we provide to students and families. We used to go to shelters and to schools and libraries and set up these legal clinics and go to the community. So obviously, with school buildings being closed, we had to transition to doing it remotely. So that meant trying to set up virtual legal clinics and shelters, relying a lot on caseworkers, on phone calls, which definitely made it very difficult. And then as well, a lot prior to the pandemic, a lot of the legal issues we addressed were things around transportation, school uniforms, and different things that allowed students to actually physically access school. So with to remote learning, we really switched to focusing on access to computers and Wi-Fi and services that families needed, like access to meals, now that things were remote. So it kind of made how we did our services different, but it also impacted kind of what services we needed to help the community with.
Thank you so much. Can you explain what living doubled up means and why that's important to understand when discussing homelessness support programs?
Yeah, so doubled up is kind of the colloquial term we use to describe someone who is experiencing homelessness by sharing housing with someone else. In the McKinney-Vento Federal Homeless Assistance Act, it describes it as when you lose your housing due to an economic reason or something similar and have to share housing with someone else. So we also can refer to it as like couch surfing. And what makes it important is that the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness experience it by living doubled up. They might not actually be accessing a shelter or staying on the street like we might typically think of, but they're typically staying with a friend or a relative in their house. Now, I think one of the misconceptions is, well, isn't that better? You know, they have a technical place to stay, they have a building. But what we learned during the pandemic and even before is that it's actually very uncertain and a very difficult way to live. You don't have any legal right to be there, right? You're the people who you're staying with can kick you out at any time, and they have a legal right to do that. So even different than in a shelter where you might have some legal rights, you don't have any to stay if you're staying doubled up. Overcrowded, and we saw with COVID, a lot of families being displaced because the people they were staying with no longer felt safe to have, this overcrowded residence. Sometimes too, there can be issues with resources because it's not always, that the people who let you stay have a lot of extra resources, but they're just trying to help. And so it can be a strain on both families. So this is disproportionately over 80% how people experience homelessness. And for the educational definition of experiencing homelessness, doubled up does count. So if you're living doubled up, you qualify under McKinney-Vento and for services in CPS. But for other federal programs, like for HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development, living doubled up doesn't count. So even though this represents the majority of how people experience homelessness, and even though it's a very vulnerable situation, there's just not as many services for people who are living doubled up.
Thank you, Alyssa. What has been revealed about the relationship with homeless support programs and public schools during the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically with what you've just been touching on?
Yeah, so I think what really was highlighted, one thing, was how much of a center schools are for families to access services, right? So, community programs connect with schools, and often that is how they get services to families. So now, when these school buildings were closed, some of the things, obviously, people were concerned about education, right? That kids were going to lose education. But I don't think people realize just how much schools do, that they were, providing food and access to healthcare and even housing, right? That they were a connection for families to access these services and these community services. So I think, it really highlighted that. And I think it's been really difficult for service providers to access families. But at the same time, I think a lot of service providers have really done amazing work and used a lot of creativity to provide services to families. And I think COVID, I think it highlighted what was already going on, right? That it was already challenging to access services, that, there wasn't enough of these services to actually provide the care that families needed who were experiencing homelessness. And really showed just the need for robust funding and, systems in place so families can get the basic necessities that they need.
Thank you. Homeless youth were disproportionately impacted by the switch to online learning. How has the gradual return to in-person learning impacted the families that you're working with?
Yeah, so I think that, distance learning has been hard for, I think, every family. But I think in particular, families experiencing homelessness had so many more hurdles that they had to face to even access distance learning. So whether that was access to computers or Wi-Fi or just physical space for their kids to be able to do school or childcare, or working jobs and sickness and all these issues. And what it showed was that the school system was struggling before the pandemic. These students, a lot of our families experiencing homelessness, the reason the transition to distance learning was so hard is because their schools weren't really set up to provide that kind of technology to families. And we saw other schools, wealthier schools, have that technology that they could give to their kids right away and make that transition smoother. So I think it highlighted, you know, that issue in and of itself and how already it was hard to access school if you're experiencing homelessness. And now I think with schools reopening, a lot of families are very scared because they saw COVID do such, horrible things, particularly in their communities. And in CPS, disproportionately, students who experience homelessness are Black and Brown students. And so those communities were also the most heavily impacted by COVID. And so I think there's a lot of fear to return to school. I think a lot of families are skeptical of CPS's ability to keep kids safe. And I think that it's going to take a lot of, outreach and input from CPS and from parents and a lot of collaboration to really get that trust and buy-in to make the reopening happen smoothly. Because I think a lot of families are still really scared. And I think one big issue, identifying homeless students is so critical to getting them the services they need. And that identification part, the burden is on the school. So with schools closed, identification went down drastically. I think in this last month, when we compare it to prior to last year around this time, it went down about, I think it's around 24% or 26%. Of the number of homeless students identified. And so we know that there is a lot of students who have been disconnected from school, who have not been identified and are not receiving the services they need. And so I think with reopening, schools are going to have to really push to identify families, because I also think there's going to be a lot of families who maybe never experienced homelessness in the past that now are going to be experiencing homelessness because of loss of jobs and sickness and being forced to leave. And so if they're and with the eviction moratorium, in place, we don't know exactly when that's going to end. And that could mean a lot of families are at jeopardy of losing where they're staying. So I think with reopening, there's going to need to be a really big push to identify families to make sure they are getting those services to re-engage with school, as a lot of families, have been disconnected. And I think that particularly impacted families who are experiencing homelessness and maybe are more transient or don't have as much access to, that connection to schools.
Thank you. Can you discuss the intersection between affordable housing and support for families experiencing homelessness in Chicago?
Yeah, so I think at its heart, the way to address homelessness and to address the issues that students experiencing homelessness deal with is affordable housing, is to provide housing. We can do all these other types of services and provide them, and we need to, but at the end of the day, to really address the issue, it's around housing, and there just is an affordable housing crisis. We don't have enough currently, and we don't have enough robust wraparound housing either. And I know at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, we really believe in a housing first model that, providing housing to families helps all the other processes to kind of thrive in life occur. So having housing makes it easier to access medical care and to access education. And all those things are all interconnected, right? So if you don't have housing, you are more at risk for different health complications. That means students experiencing homelessness are more likely to have health issues that prevent them from accessing school. And so they're all deeply connected. And so to really address housing, you have to address to address homelessness, you have to address affordable housing. And I think during the pandemic, it just became so clear, we were telling families to shelter in place when not every family had access to, safe shelter. So I think that, that is a huge thing that there needs to be focus on. And I know there are really great community organizations, including the Coalition for the Homeless, that are working on affordable housing. And I think it's something that we really need to rethink our relationship to in terms of really supporting the education of homeless students, is figuring out, ways to provide housing that people can actually access and afford.
Thank you, Alyssa. My final question for you is, what is something you would like to share with Chicagoans about how families in Chicago are experiencing homelessness that they may not know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one thing that's really important is to realize that homelessness looks different for every family, that it's nuanced. It's not maybe the vision we have in our minds of what it looks like. And so I think that it's really important to address homelessness, to really realize that it encompasses so many ways of life. And there's so many different reasons people experience homelessness, from broken relationships to mental health to sickness, and physical health, loss of jobs, loss of loved ones. There's so many reasons. And I think having that compassion, that if we have policies that provide that protection, everybody is in some way one day away from experiencing homelessness, right? It's one loss of a job or a broken relationship. We just don't know. So creating policies that support families experiencing homelessness promotes and protects our society for everyone. And I think is really essential to having that thriving community, is to, create compassionate and robust policies for people. And I think that's really important.
My thanks to you, Alyssa Phillips, for joining us today to have this important discussion. And thank you for watching. This was CAN TV Chicago Conversations. Thank you so much, Alyssa.
Thank you.